Hi, I'm Kirk Short here with the Wichita home team at Keller Williams Signature Partners, and we're starting up our podcast again, Real Conversations with Kirk Short. And today I have a really neat guest. This is Ron Ryan, formerly with Ryan Aviation, and currently board member with the Kansas Aviation Museum. And hopefully through this process, I'll learn what else you're involved in so we can add that to the back of your name. So today I just wanted to talk with Ron. He's been a staple in the Wichita area and made his mark in aviation. And since we are the air capital of the world, and my involvement with the museum and Ron's mutual involvement, I figured we'd have a talk.
Very good. Look forward to it.
So I want to know I want to know more about you. You've been a businessman in Wichita. You've become a successful businessman in Wichita, and you started out from the ground up. And
Literally.
literally,
I thought maybe that was a pun.
I want to know more. I want to know. I want to know. I want to know more about you and just sort of your life and how you did what you did, because you've had an opportunity to have interactions and successes with some of Wichita's most successful people. And so talk to me about you.
Well, I think the first thing that I can say is I've certainly been blessed by the good Lord.
Okay.
And I know that when I meet my Maker, and it won't be that much longer, the first thing he's going to say to me is, "Do you know how many angels I used up on you?"
How many?
A lot, a lot. But I'm just a average guy. I came from a family of 7 kids. My folks were extremely poor, but they really wanted to have 7 kids before they got married,
Yeah.
which I said if I had 7 kids, I'd either drown myself or half of them. I'm not sure which.
Oh, jeez.
But I was born and raised up in Burlington, Iowa, right on the Mississippi River. And some say that's where I got water on the brain, but I lived there until I was about 20 years old.
Okay.
Then moved to Kansas City for a few years where I got into aviation.
Okay.
It was after I'd graduated as a tool and die maker
Really?
from Western Electric, then promoted into engineering and expected to get an engineering degree. And after a couple of years and 21 college credits and finally getting into calculus, I said, this sucks. And fortunately, TWA was headquartered in Kansas City.
Yeah.
And I happened to meet their chief pilot, and he said, you ought to go learn to fly because we're hiring low-time pilots. So 6 months later, I had my private commercial and instrument rating, and I said, here I are a pilot. And fortunately, I didn't get on, but it was very devastating. But I stayed in Kansas City for about 8 years, and then one day somebody came to, well, actually I took a job, full-time job at Fort Leonard Wood at Skyway Aviation as their chief pilot,
Okay.
flying military prisoners and VIPs, and
Yeah.
then came back to Kansas City and started as a flight instructor there, because back then they had the GI program, and we were
Right.
doing flight instruction for about 5 or 6 junior colleges. So we had quite a fleet of airplanes. I had 15 or 20 Cessna 150s and had a Cessna 310. But the people who were running the place were a Learjet dealership. Back then in the early 60s, when they first developed the Lear, Bill Lear set up kind of like an automobile dealership. He would sell his Lears through different outlets. And Midwest Lear was in Kansas City, and we had a Lear 24 that was for sale.
Really?
But in the interim, we'd charge it and they'd use it for the owners of the company. Well, through a series of circumstances, which were kind of interesting, it's in my book here, where I was flying one of the owners one day in the 310 up to Omaha and back. And on the way back, I put the gear down and it would only come halfway down.
That wasn't good.
Yeah, it was not good. It was a beautiful day and a clear day, and it was at Fairfax Airport there in Kansas City, and tried to crank it down, and I actually broke the chain. Well, I flew around, and of course, the old 310s were two-bladed props, and I shut the right engine down and feathered the prop where it was flat. And then I came in and landed the airplane, and before I came over the levee, I shut the left one down. And I opted to land on the grass instead of the runway.
Yeah.
And The airplane slid for a little bit, the gear collapsed back up in it, and but the guy that was in the back, I'd put him in the back seat because I didn't, and then I popped the door before I landed. He said, "Ron, if you'll get me down and not hurt me, I'll give you $1 million." And he was scared. But what he didn't understand is the pilot's always the first one to the scene of the accident. And
if there's anybody who does not want to die, it's the guy flying
it's the guy flying the plane, that is for sure. Well, we got down and he bought me a nice steak dinner, and I thought, because I knew the $1 million thing was not for, but the next day he said, "How would you like to be co-pilot on the Learjet?"
Really?
And there was a guy by the name of Colonel Myers who was flying it, and that right seat job was very coveted. And I said, would I? Would I? So I wound up flying co-pilot with Earl, and whenever we had to service the airplane, it of course had to be serviced in Wichita, Kansas.
Right.
So we'd fly up to Wichita to do our servicing and usually be here a day or two. And I met a number of people, and I liked Wichita. And one day I got a call from a friend of mine at the Learjet factory saying, "Hey, there's a guy in Wichita, just moved here. His name's Jack DeBoer, and he's flying a Cessna 310, but he's looking at a Lear, and he's looking for a pilot. And we mentioned you, and he said, if you'd come up, he'd interview you." So on a Friday afternoon, I jumped in one of those Cessna 150s, flew to Wichita, flew Jack and Jerry Gaddis around the pattern a couple of times, and he said, "You're hired. How much do you want?" And that's the way he put it. And I told him, and he said, "Fine." And I went,
first start of negotiation, right?
Yeah,
you don't tell them what you want.
Yeah, that's exactly. But bottom line, he hired me, and I came to work in 1968 for Jack DeBoer as his chief pilot. And I was fortunate enough in my tenure since 1968 in Wichita to have Jack DeBoer as my partner until '73, when he got into financial difficulties. And then through a series of circumstances, George Ablaw came into the picture. And so I've been blessed to have worked with Jack DeBoer and George Ablaw. I said, if something doesn't rub off on you, just by happenstance with those two people, there's something wrong with you.
See, that's our tie to real estate, right?
Right.
You know, these are big real estate moguls.
Well, I was there when Jack DeBoer put Coma Terra together.
Yeah.
His offices were on the east side of town, and he worked with Wygan, and he had Wygan go out and get a whole bunch of options on that property and do it quietly, so the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing.
Yeah.
And as time has proven, it worked out quite well.
Yeah.
But Jack was one of those guys, he was either on the top of the mountain or down in the valley financially, because he was a real entrepreneur and a risk taker, but incredibly bright guy. And unfortunately, we just lost him here a few weeks ago.
Yeah, that was.
And we lost George a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But two great individuals that were not only good for themselves, but really good for the community and the city, and very giving people, caring people, and real developers of men and real estate.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, they you know, the one thing I've sat there and learned, at least from, you know, people that I know, I've had the pleasure of hearing Jack speak and you know, talk about successes and failures. Not so much with George in the past, but you know, everybody, at least that I know that's known them, very intense businessmen, but in the same breath, I mean, from what I know, very open about helping people that asked.
Yeah, and I watched both of those individuals help a lot of people where they didn't want any recognition for it. And they said, we'll do this, but you got to keep it quiet.
Yeah.
And I have a great deal of admiration for those kind of people that want to do it because it's from their heart, not because they want their ego to be stroked.
Absolutely, absolutely. So how did Ryan Aviation, because that's what you're most known for, at least from my side of things, right? And for those that aren't aware, Ryan Aviation was a fairly large business coming out of Wichita So tell me about Ryan Aviation. Tell me about what did they do and how did they become?
Most people didn't really know much about us,
Yeah.
although we were based here. We didn't have any airplanes here.
Okay.
And we had about 60 large aircraft. Uh, the biggest ones were DC-10s with
Okay.
389 seats in each one of them,
That's a big plane.
flying 3 days a week, one out of San Francisco and one out of Los Angeles to Hawaii. Then we had 40 freighter airplanes, 727s, primarily flying for the Postal Service and for Emory Air Freight. And
Okay.
then we had about 20 airplanes flying passengers.
Okay.
Most of it was for wholesale charter operators, but we had 5 727s that were set up for executive travel, where
Right.
we'd fly rock groups in VIPs. And for example, we flew U2 in Europe for a full month.
Really?
And we flew Geraldine Ferraro when she was running for vice president for a month. But these 5 727s only had 50 seats in them.
Okay.
But we flew the Dream Team in Chicago for a couple of years. And there's lots of stories. Most of them I have now down in my book, which should be out in a couple of weeks.
Okay, shameless plug. Right? Well, there is no shameless plug, and this is what's really cool. All right, this is the advanced copy of his book. So, Making Money: My Life as a High-Time Pilot, and Ron's put this together. I was telling him when I was breezing through this. I mean, it is the whole story of your life.
Right.
And I assume successes and failures or difficult times and kind of what made you who you are. And now, how are people going to get that if they want to check this out?
Well, we're going to sell it primarily through the Kansas Aviation Museum,
Okay.
where they'll benefit from the sale of the book.
Awesome. And Kansas Aviation Museum, it sits right there on the north side of Spirit and McConnell. And if you've not been out to the museum, Ron's a board member there. It's an absolutely incredible place. A lot of neat things, a lot of neat opportunities, and so come out and get your copy of the book, and we'll make sure that we have in the description, if you want one, how to buy a copy of it through the museum.
And I might add that Kirk is a board of directors and promoted here just in the last 6 months or so to the chairman of the board, and is doing an incredibly good job for a very worthwhile cause.
I appreciate it.
I always was so disappointed and frustrated because I love Wichita and everything about it, but I thought of an aviation capital of the world and not having an aviation museum where you can study the history. Because when I came to Wichita, I thought aviation was popular here because it was flat and windy. And even
Then you found out.
Then I found out you had a guy by the name of Jake Mollendick, who was an oil man that had money for entrepreneurs, and you had Cessna and Beach come along with Stearman,
Yeah.
and they all worked together,
Yep.
but they had entrepreneurial spirit amongst them. And in the simplest way I can say it, they built the Swallow aircraft, had a successful company, and they all three, being strong entrepreneurs and engineering people themselves, you know, one wanted the wing on the top of the airplane, the other one wanted the wing on the bottom of the airplane, and the third one wanted the wing on the bottom and the top.
So, and here's different companies now,
and
right?
now all three companies, and of course,
Yeah.
if it hadn't been for Stearman, there may have never been a Boeing or a military or McConnell Air Force Base here.
See, that's just amazing.
And there's just so much history here. And the fact that we lost Boeing is
Yeah.
because we weren't paying attention.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, I didn't realize till going, well, a couple things, right? There's a lot of people I've ran into that love aviation, can talk about aircraft, but can't talk the history of aircraft. And that's what I like about you. But, you know, Wichita had, what'd they say, 30 some odd companies that were producing aircraft in Wichita. And a lot of people don't realize that part of Wichita's history. They hear us talking about air capital of the world, and they think of Cessna, and they think of Beach, and they think of with Textron and Boeing and Lear and just little bits and pieces and relationships here in this city, but they don't realize the history of it is so much more. And So it's been really neat, especially being able to serve on the board with you and the rest of the folks on the board that have such a vast knowledge of the history. So yeah, as the current president, thank you for what you do as it relates to that. So I do want to say that. Um, I want to go back to Ryan Aviation because the average person does not come from just being pilot and end up with 60 some odd aircraft. And how did you do what you did?
Well, in abbreviated story, of course, I was flying for Jack DeBoer.
Yeah,
He got into financial trouble,
yeah,
and the bank said, just let the airplanes go back to the
Yeah.
lenders. And I said, there's an equity in these airplanes. So I was able to convince Citibank, which was Jack's bank,
yeah.
to sign a promissory note for $96,000, which at that time I thought that was more money than even God had. And I became partners with Jack's wife, Marilyn DeBoer, wonderful woman. But I owned 20% and she owned 80% because the
Okay.
bank wouldn't let Jack have anything to do with it. So started a charter operation.
Okay.
And people said, oh, you'll never be able to support a jet charter operation out of Wichita, Kansas,
Right.
which simply proved not to be the case. Well, one of my first customers, or not first customers, but after I'd been doing it for a while, I got a call one day from a guy, and he said, I own a gas plant down in Ozona, Texas, and there's been an explosion down there, and I want to know how quick you could get me there. And I said, in an hour. And he said, well, my name's George Ablaw, and I'll be out there. So I called a friend of mine and asked about George and said, oh, you really got to watch that guy. He's not very straight, which proved to be absolutely, totally untrue. He was probably the most honest guy I've ever met in my life, or one of them. But bottom line, we flew him to Ozona. The explosion hadn't been that bad. While he was there, he got a call. I flew him to Minneapolis, St. Paul, where his bank was, and he had a meeting there. And while he was there, a realtor called him about a deal in Atlanta, Georgia. So I flew him to Atlanta, Georgia, and then we were back by that evening. And so he had took another couple of trips, and he came in one day and he said, I want to buy this company. And I said, well, I only own 20%. Marilyn DeBoer owns 80. It's really
Right.
Jack. So George bought half of Marilyn stock, so it was 40, 40, 20. George said to me, he said, if I can work with Jack DeBoer, he said, I think he's got the brightest real estate mind of anybody I've ever met.
Yeah.
But with those two personalities, it was like trying to mix oil and water.
Yeah.
So one day Jack came to me and said, we're going to buy George out. And I said, how are we going to do that? And he said, well, we're going to sell this and the assets that and I said, Jack, I'm just not willing to do that. That's not fair.
Yeah.
So Jack said, well, it's either me or George. And I said, please don't put me into that position. Well, he got up, and when he walked out of my office, he slammed the door so hard the pictures literally fell off the wall.
Oh, Jesus.
But so George bought the rest of his stock, and George came to me and said, now, Ron, we're going to be 50-50 partners. So he gave me 30% of the stock.
Really?
And so we started then Ryan Aviation, because up until that time it was called DeBoer Aviation.
Okay.
But George and I became partners. He said, all I want is good, safe transportation.
Yeah.
And he said, if you want to develop this into anything else, you can. So we started flying charters with Citations and Learjets.
Yeah.
Then I had an opportunity to get a contract with Emory, flying 8 Cessna Citations carrying freight.
Right.
He was trying to compete with Fred Smith at Federal Express.
Okay.
And those 8 Citations turned into 5 727s when we converted from Ryan Aviation and it was doing a DBA as Ryan International Airlines.
Okay.
So I started flying 5 727s for Emory, which is a lot of story to get from a 135 operator to a Part 121 operator. But I started flying those 5 airplanes, and UPS called and said, hey, you guys seem to have the best on-time record with 7.2s, and we just bought 10 727 freighters and want to know if you'll be willing to operate them for us. And I said, well, I have to go talk to Emory because my contract says I can't fly for a competitor.
Right.
So I went to talk to Emory, and they said, absolutely not. They're our competitor. And I said, well, let me show you what the cost difference would be in operating your 5 if I'm operating 15 instead of 5. So I guess maybe you can do that.
Cost benefit.
Yeah. So we developed a really close relationship with UPS and
Really?
put those 727s online for them, and then we actually put their very first brand new 757 freighter out of the factory online for them some years later. But in 1986, I was able to sell the company because prior to that time we'd gotten into the passenger business, and George loved being in the freight business.
Yep.
But when we got into the passenger business, the Department of Transportation, and they wanted George's personal financial statement, with no such thing.
Yep.
But George was frustrated with the passenger side of it.
Yep.
And he said, Ron, buy me out or take me out, but I don't like the passenger side, but keep doing what you're doing until we get out. So we sold to a New York Stock Exchange company called PHH, Peterson, Heather and Howell. They took it over, but I had to sign a covenant not to compete.
Okay.
So I was out of the real estate business. I mean, out of the aviation business, and decided, well, I'll make even more money. I'll do like Kirk. I'll get into the real estate business. So I gave back a lot of the money I made on the sale of the
People from my industry appreciate you. Just saying.
But I watched PHH destroy the company.
Yeah.
They ran off the customers at the fixed base operation at the airport. And,
That's hard, isn't it?
yeah, it's heartbreaking because I had a lot of really good people.
Yeah.
So in '88, 2 years and 1 day later, I made them an offer to buy it back with pennies on the dollar, and I literally mean pennies. And they agreed. So I bought it back, and at the time, of course, we had the fixed base operation at the airport, but I only had 2 employees and the air carrier certificate. But the FAA was trying to pick up the air carrier certificate because they didn't have any airplanes. They'd lost all their airplanes. And I called a good friend I had by the name of Chuck Zabarik at Emory. And I said, I got my company back, but I don't have any airplanes. And I said, do you have something I can use? And he said, we just bought Purolator. And with Purolator, we got 9 DC-9s, baby 9s. And he said, would one of those do? And I said, please. So the next day he had it flown into Wichita and leased it to me for $1 a month.
And you had your aircraft.
And I took my certificate and my lease, and I went to the FAA, and that's where we started.
That's crazy. So it's a round robin.
Yeah, it's friendships that you make and developing trust. And trust only comes from being trustworthy.
Yep, I agree with that.
There's a lot of times when I said I'd do something that after I said it, I thought, oh, crap. I wish
you did it.
But we did it.
Yeah.
And I love dealing with people that I feel comfortable where our word is our bond.
Yeah, it's that comes harder and harder to find, it seems like, in these days compared to what it seemed like it was back then. But
and that's sad.
I like that.
And that's
like
sad. But that's why I love Wichita, because there's such a, I've been here since 1968, probably longer than a lot of people who've been alive.
Yes.
But 12 years ago, I had a condo down in Florida where I'd stay there in the winter months, and I got a call saying we've got your granddaughter up in Hiawatha, Kansas, and she was 10 years old at the time, and she's going to go into state custody tomorrow unless you get her. Well, my wife and I were at our place down at Grand Lake in Oklahoma at the time when we got that call. So we drove up there and picked her up and said, we're going to raise her, and decided North Miami Beach wasn't the place to try to raise a 10-year-old girl.
No.
And said if there's any place in the world that a young girl like this who's come out of a drug-infested family has a chance, it would be Wichita, Kansas.
Really?
So we raised her here in Wichita. She went to Trinity, and she's now at WSU and doing well.
That's really cool. I didn't realize that. That's a neat story to do that.
But Wichita is just a great place.
So let me ask you this: for those that are watching, just talking about Wichita, one thing I sit there and hear a lot of times about people that have primarily only lived in Wichita, always think the grass is greener on the other side, right? They don't appreciate what Wichita really has. So if you were to tell them your real why outside of your granddaughter and raising her, why Wichita means so much to you, what would you tell them?
Well, it's a caring, giving city. You think about all the things that depend on charitable giving.
Yep.
We have a lot of it here in Wichita.
We do.
But and when I was running a 121 operation, it's an airline operation, and a lot of the positions in that company, we had like 2,500 employees,
Yeah.
not all here, but a lot of the positions in that company required 121 experience. So I had to go outside of Wichita
Right.
to find these people. And you'd bring them here, and either the employee or the spouse would say, I don't want to live in Wichita, Kansas. But if I could get them here for 6 months,
Yep.
if I could get them here for 6 months, then they didn't want to leave.
Yeah.
And the same thing's true of McConnell Air Force Base.
Yeah.
We get some really great benefits from retirees out of McConnell
Yes.
because they come here going, Wichita, Kansas, and after they're here for a while,
They come back.
and they want to live here.
Yeah.
Because, and you know, I don't always particularly agree with some of our city councilmen and
Yep.
county councilmen, but I got to tell you, overall,
They do a good job.
do an excellent job.
Yeah.
Because we live in not a crime-free by any stretch, because no city is, but I feel safe in Wichita.
Yep.
There's entertainment here. We don't have any oceans or mountains, but we have a lot of stuff that's, I can always go to the oceans and go to the mountains.
Absolutely.
But if I'm going to go put my head on my pillow and go to sleep and feel comfortable, I want it to be in Wichita.
I like hearing that. I definitely want to thank Ron Ryan for coming and joining me in having this episode right now. And you are an inspiration to me the more I get to know you, because I like being around successful people and learning from them. That's how I try to improve my life and myself. And you know, hopefully people that are watching this are going to be able to do, you know, maybe a little bit of that, just get a nugget out of it. Again, wonderful book that he's put together, and Kansas Aviation Museum is going to have this available again in the description of the video here. Find it, get online, come out to the museum. We'll get you all hooked up to be able to purchase it. And if you're watching this on Facebook or any other social media sites that we have, make sure you like us and subscribe to us. And Ron,
God bless, my friend.
appreciate you very, very much. And till next time, I'm Kirk Short with the Wichita home team at Keller Williams. And we'll have another conversation with me and someone special coming soon. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.